Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the next installment of the Spring 2022 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture here at the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. As always, with me is AAS Digitization Coordinator Amanda Kondik. Today's guest is Hannah Farber, who in a few moments will share a presentation on her new book, Underwriters of the United States: How Insurance Shaped the American Founding, published by the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture and the University of North Carolina Press. For those interested in purchasing their own copy of the book, the publishers have provided us with a discount code for 40% off the title, which will be provided shortly in the chat. Before introducing today's guest, I would like to briefly introduce the Society for Newcomers. AAS was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're dedicated to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to this virtual book talk series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships, and we welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. Now I would like to turn things over to Amanda, who will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. The chat function is open, so feel free to send your comments to everyone. Throughout the program, I'll be posting information in the chat relating to our speaker, AAS, and FIBAC, and you should be able to save the chat by clicking on the three dots once you open the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me in the chat. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for our speaker during or after their presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you'll also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon. Closed captioning is also available for this afternoon's program via Zoom's live transcription function. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC. And finally, I would like to let everyone know we are recording this program and we'll be posting it on our website and our YouTube channel. So thank you, Kevin, and back to you.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And now on to our program. Hannah Farber is an assistant professor of history at Columbia University. Her research focuses on politics and economy in colonial North America, the early American Republic, and the Atlantic world. Her first book, the subject of today's talk, Underwriters of the United States: How Insurance Shaped the American Founding, again, was published this past November by the Omohundro Institute and UNC Press. Professor Farber holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. She is also a series editor of American Beginnings, 1500 to 1900, at the University of Chicago Press. Hannah held an NEH fellowship at the New York Historical Society during 2020-2021, and she was a Peterson Fellow here at AAS 2011 to 2012. With that, I'd like to welcome Hannah Farber.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Kevin, and thanks to Amanda and the Society for having me. It's really a lovely thing to be able to come back to a place where I started some of my earliest rounds of research for this project, which is really wonderful. Hoping the screen share works for you all now. So sometimes when people ask me about this project, what I hear them actually asking is like, you can't really have written a book about insurance, can you? Is that really what this book is about? So just to make things easier for everyone, I'll give you the cheat sheet version of the story, which is that this book is about finance in the age of the American founding. It's about this moment when a powerful old international business comes to terms with the fragile new republic and makes a bet on it, and reaps some of the rewards. And from the highest level, it's about how economic risk-taking and political risk-taking are intertwined with one another. So I like to start with this funny story that made me realize that insurance might be more than the most boring thing that anybody could possibly imagine. And it's about this character here, the Philadelphia-born journalist and playwright Mordecai Noah, who is a utopian. He's all kinds of things. He wants to start a new Jerusalem in upstate New York, I think, something like that. But the main point is he's a staunch supporter of James Madison, and he is appointed to serve as the United States consul in Tunis in the middle of the War of 1812. So he gets on an American merchant ship that's headed for France. And they are captured by a British frigate to his captain's dismay. Now, the result of this capture was not the sort of humiliation that American sailors often experienced or violence that they experienced at the hands of the Brits, but as sort of a fun chit-chat with the admiral of this little British fleet that they were captured by. The British admiral takes Mordecai Noah and the captain on board and serves them drinks. And it turns out he's keeping score in the war in his own right. He shows them a little score sheet, like in baseball or something. He's got a list of the American vessels that the Brits have captured in the past year. He calculates that their value exceeds 800,000 pounds sterling. And he says, you American merchants are foolish to be trying to ship goods to France, to the continent, to get things past us. You're not going to win. And he says, let me make sure I can go to my next slide here. He says that the American merchants are calculating erroneously. If one vessel gets through our blockade, safe out of 3, that there'll be no loser because prices are so high if you get your goods through the blockades. He says, if even this was the case, it is impossible that the aggregate profits of the one will cover the loss of the 2. So this admiral is doing a surprising amount of merchant shipmaster calculating, and he says, but it must be known in the aggregate 1 vessel out of 3 does not arrive. And then he goes on, again, probably drinking, probably a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but that's all right. He says, but if your insurance companies don't complain, they will never hear any objections on my part, because he, as the capturing admiral, gets a cut of what he captures. Under such circumstances, I have no objection to the continuance of the war. So at first I thought this was really funny, because why is this admiral saying that the insurance companies are determining whether the war is going to continue or not? And then I said, wait a minute, this is an admiral who's saying really that, in this war that's largely conducted through the capture of commercial vessels.
Hannah, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt there. Your slide is actually black right now. We don't see any of the slides.
Did the first one go or not at all?
It did not.
Okay. It was doing okay in our preview, wasn't it?
It definitely was.
All right, let me come out and then I'll go back in again and see what happens. We might have to go to that presenter view that we didn't like as much. How's this? Kevin, is this better?
Still nothing.
Okay. Sometimes they just throw these surprises at you. That's all right. Okay, I'm going to go back in. What about this? No?
Nothing yet.
Okay, I'm going to do this one more time. I think sometimes maybe my Zoom preferences get a little bit confused. This is the one we didn't like as much. I'm just going to get out of this completely. Slideshow from start. And then luckily, after Zoom teaching for a year, nothing scares me now. How about here, Kevin? Can you see this?
It is not coming up. I'm sorry to say.
Okay. That's never happened to me before. So my Zoom slide shows how the bullet point is thinking. I can email it to you guys, I suppose.
If you'd like to email that to me and maybe continue, and then I'll catch up to you if that's
right.
doable. I apologize for the interruption here. We did have this working just 5 minutes ago.
I know we did. That's just how it is sometimes. Okay, I'm going to copy this. All right, so he basically says, all right, so Kevin, you'll catch up with me when you get it. It's a Dropbox link.
Perfect,
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let me see myself for a second. All right, so what I started to see when I looked a little bit more deeply into that information is that insurance was actually everywhere and it was nowhere at the same time. It was everywhere in city directories, in newspapers. If you get one of these, if you page through one of these city directories like they have in the collections at the American Antiquarian Society, where it sort of starts with all of the information that you might need to know about Boston in 1807, and lots of people are looking for specific names. But if you look at the very beginning, where the mindset of the city directory guy is that he's going to tell you what's important to know about the city. One of the interesting things that you'll see is that they feel this compulsion after the sort of latitude and longitude of the city and the churches there and the banks. They always include the insurance companies as sort of institutions that mark or define the city. You see them in newspapers announcing new slates of corporate directors that announce their dividends sometimes, announcements of insurance rates that can be obtained in particular American cities for particular destinations. And all of this sort of ramps up pretty quickly in the first decade of the 19th century. And at the same time, insurance is actually quite a quiet business in public life compared to the most comparable business, which is the business of American banking, which is sort of a better known quantity. Oh, hello, there's some slides. It's a better known quantity. Can you go to the city directory slide? Right, so banking is a pretty known quantity. Banks very quickly start to make these displays to the public that they're safe, they're secure, they build these elaborate buildings. The first American insurance companies, again, before the first part of the 19th century, before the mid-19th century, they just don't have much to say to the public. And so it's really hard to reconcile how much money was actually going through these corporations because they didn't have very much of anything to say to the public. All right, so in theory, I agree with Kevin that the way to proceed here, as we agreed on, in theory, it's usually to sort of drill down to the story of one chapter, but honestly, this book has never excerpted very well. It's always been about like the big picture and all these pieces together, which is what made it so hard to see at the time. So since he also said that these are book people and they're like feeling good about seeing chapters of a book, I'm going to sort of take you through the arc of the story to put things together. Next slide, please. All right, so the first chapter of this book is sort of about leading up to the revolution. It's about this not very political infrastructure through which insurance works. It's sort of political in a unique sense. It's like building up in the American colonies and in Britain during the 18th century, where it sort of has the potential to become politicized. So marine insurance is this very old and very deeply international business that's controlled by merchants themselves. And it is designed to facilitate trade across international boundaries. People tend to want it most, and it tends to be worth the most in periods of political disruption, risk, and danger. And for all these reasons, you never get the whole story about insurance if you look at national laws. I mean, you have to also see insurance through the ways that merchants themselves see insurance through the books that they publish to explain and organize the insurance business for themselves. Next slide, please. So what insurers say is that, what merchants say is that insurance is a merchant-controlled business by merchants for business, and it is practiced according to the laws of merchants. And you can get books that explain what the laws of merchants are. Do a lot of people read all the works of the laws of merchants from cover to cover? They do not. Nonetheless, this is sort of this intellectual touchstone for where the laws governing insurance come from. They come from this merchant-controlled world. And this statement that insurance is conducted according to the laws of merchants has both a reality and a mythology to it. So what's real? You can really find out a lot. That's how I started learning about insurance, was by reading these books and seeing what they say about how insurance works. As you know, if you have an insurance policy, you have to accept your insurer's rules in order for your insurance policy to operate. And that could be the specific terms of your policy. It's also sort of acceding to the general laws that are customarily understood to govern the business of insurance. If the merchant customer doesn't follow his insurer's dictates, he's not going to be indemnified for any losses. So the insurer can force the merchant customer to follow what he, the insurer, thinks the proper laws of insurance are. But the insurer is also vulnerable in a way to his merchant customer. Next slide, please. That is because the custom of the insurer is that the merchant is not obligated to inform the insurer. The merchant's not obligated to inform the insurer of anything the insurer is already supposed to know. It's like the insurer is sort of spiritually supposed to be on board the ship already, to know about weather, to know about proper routes, to know about who you should bribe and who you shouldn't bribe. So both merchants and insurers have to have a ton of information about the proper function of insurance at all times. They have to sort of share this expectation that insurance works in a way that they generally vernacularly understand. Now, the books about insurance have a weird confidence about the timelessness of the insurance business. And this is the mythology part. They say that insurance, like Gerard Maline's here, has always, under the laws of merchants, has always been the same everywhere, constant, permanent. It's just common sense. It's just how merchants do things. It has this sort of self-perpetuating quality to it. That's not true. The business of insurance changes all the time. But by constantly repeating this, and Gerard Malines is a government official, and many of the insurance experts who follow him are also in government, merchants are able to constantly reseed in the minds of these officials of early modern states the idea that, oh yeah, insurance is this really important business that's by merchants, it's for merchants. It's the same way everywhere in all times, and it's really valuable, and we have to let it function the way it functions. And again, there's this weird little grain of truth to this self-aggrandizing portrayal of the insurance business because it is international in its bones, because it's this business that's born in the Italian city-states. It's born in Genoa. It's not the project of a big empire. It's meant to handle political disruptions, which is when it becomes the most valuable and profitable. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the quote that I meant these to be in the other order, but this is the quote that says, "The law presumes every underwriter to be perfectly acquainted with the course of trade and the voyage he ventures to insure. It's unnecessary for the merchant to inform the underwriter that which he ought to know." So most underwriters have to be merchants, which means that there's this sort of self-governing merchant group. Every time you have an underwriting outfit, you sort of have some self-governing merchants, and one question is, how much do they slurp up everybody else's money into their underwriting project? Next slide, please. All right, so we move on to the American Revolution. What changes during the American Revolution? Next slide, please. Some things change, some things don't. So especially during the 7 Years' War, insurance brokerages take shape on the British North American coast, especially in Philly, also places you would expect like Boston and New York. So they become this merchant infrastructure that suddenly becomes capable of politicizing. So one of the things the book talks about is the way in which insurance becomes one way in which American privateers manage pooling their own risk, so they can sort of share one another's ventures upfront, but they can also take one another's risks by creating these insuring pools for their own risky voyages. The slide that I have for you here is the other aspect of insurance in the Revolutionary War, which continues to be an aspect of insurance in warfare, which is this, that when, the United States doesn't have so much Navy to speak of, so a lot of what they can do is annoy the British by preying on their merchant fleets. And one way they know if they've done a good job preying on British merchant fleets is by the cost of insurance. So this is a Boston newspaper. American newspapers love reporting when foreigners' insurance rates go up, because they say, hi, this is some quantitative evidence of what we've done, or we've scared them, we've made insurance difficult for them. So this certain advice received yesterday, 9 sail of ships being taken by the American privateers has raised the insurance on all Jamaica ships and ships from the West India Islands 20 pounds per cent more than it was before. And many of the underwriters refused to enter their names on a policy, et cetera, et cetera. So when the Americans can make British political news, this furthers their ultimate war goal of making the war on them too seemingly costly and embarrassing to continue. After the revolution, things sort of subside. This business is fundamentally transnational. European financial centers are still dominant. The next 3 chapters of the book talks about this period in the 1790s when there really is structural change that creates a US insurance sector. So next slide, please. And there are a few causes to this change. One is that Americans are now able to form joint stock corporations, and over time that the taboos against forming these joint stock corporations sort of subside, and people see the advantages and start to develop intellectual frameworks for how they can fit into a democratic polity. These corporations are then in their turn able to invest. They're both legally able to invest because they're corporations now, and they have things to invest in. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then chapter 5, which I'll get to also, is about the context of war that makes this possible. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that create this high risk, high reward environment that makes insurance companies in particular worth forming. So next slide, please. So the big question during the 1790s, when people start floating this idea of insurance companies, it's overlapped with the other questions that people have about corporations in a democratic republic, which is like, are they sort of like little knots that are of people, like special interest factions that are sidestepping the real good democratic process that Americans want to have at work here? Or are they sort of licensed by the state to do important things that the state's not going to do directly? I put this image here because this is from the American Antiquarian Society. It didn't make it into the book, but this is a picture that gives us sort of a nice depiction of an American merchant. You can see there's a flag in the background here. And so this merchant, but there's all these questions about how American merchants are actually going to be, that are whipped up by like Jeffersonian politicians. But again, there's some real basis to this concern about how American they actually are, and even how American we would want them genuinely to be. Our merchants, people who are sort of doing their own thing internationally with this like private property, this complicated kind of calculation that doesn't involve anybody else, or are they Americans? How much claim do they have on the state when their international business gets in trouble? And do they sort of drain national resources for their own private interests, or are they really like invested in the state? So the fight about the first American insurance company is actually really interesting, because it's about like, should we let these merchants have this corporation to like root themselves even more deeply into the United States? Like, that's going to give them more power of the United States. If they fall, it's going to pull down harder on the United States. If they've got this corporation that a state has legitimized, if they've been allowed to make this like legal entity that then can pull in the money of a broader group of shareholders. So in this book, I want to take this really seriously as a civic problem. Okay, next chapter. Next slide, please. Another thing about insurance companies is that they need a lot of money, and they need that money to be readily available to them. They cannot lend it out to whoever necessarily. They cannot buy land with it because they have to be ready to repay, to indemnify their merchant customers in case of losses. And losses can often come in runs. So insurance companies have to invest. And luckily, a couple of things are happening at the same time as these insurance companies are forming that are giving them things to invest in. One is banks. So insurance companies and banks are these really closely interlocked institutions in a way that needed a lot more study, and still does, if somebody wants to do more on that. And we have Alexander Hamilton's new federal securities, which are available for purchase. Insurance companies are the largest institutional investors in the United States domestically, because there are markets for these securities. They can buy them, sell them as needed. But the upshot is that, if you look at it on the highest level, insurance companies are offsetting the risk of their insurance business by purchasing US debt. Just to say they're sort of sharing, they've purchased US risk, right? They're taking on the risk of the United States. They're like betting that the United States will continue to be able to service its debts, to pay interest on those securities. So they are doing what the corporate critics worried about. They're really financially tying up their own financial concerns with those of the country. Okay, so they're intertwining their own business risks with the risks of the United States. Next slide, please. So what I say in the book is that the stabilizes all three types of institutions: insurance companies, banks, governments, by sort of allowing them to financially intertwine with each other. And Kevin, you can skip through the next few slides, which just sort of give an idea, the finance slides, of how much insurance company capital there was. Keep going. How many insurance companies there are, which is so many. It's like as many as banks. How much they yield to their shareholders in dividends. A lot, although it varies a lot from year to year. Keep going. Compared to bank dividends, which are still pretty freaking high, in my opinion, but a lot more stable. Insurance companies are more volatile. And then some insurance companies are actually banks. So this is I like this banknote from the Kentucky Insurance Company, which incorporated as an insurance company. No, we're not a bank. We're just a merchant concern, an insurance company. Nonsense, they're a bank. So some of them are banks. Some of them are just very like banks and closely connected to banks, like they are today. All right, next chapter. So the last piece of what really makes insurance this huge deal, starting in the 1790s, is the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which are raging around the world. These wars pose a huge threat to American commerce. They also make American insurers really powerful. So American traders have enormous opportunities if they can get goods to war-starved ports, or if they can pick up sort of carrier routes, moving stuff around that the British or the French or whoever had previously had, and now this has all been disrupted by the war. So there's big opportunity. The United States has a big merchant fleet, so it's poised to take advantage of that opportunity, but trade is risky, and the US doesn't have much naval defense. And again, the very functionality of the US government is dependent on this working out, because almost all of the federal government's revenue is from customs. So trade has to keep going. Okay, so the insurers are doing this like civic work by pooling the risks that Americans take in trade. They're making it possible for the US government to continue running on the broadest level. So insurers, next slide, please. Insurance companies make it possible for merchants to engage in this high risk, high reward world. Again, the risk is not always even formal war or being captured by an enemy. It's like being captured by a friend, being detained, mistakes, delays, things that make your goods rot in the harbor. You take a detour that's more dangerous. All of this, and really more than out and out war against the United States, which the United States faced in 1812, but it's this like delay and inconvenience world, the uncertainties of law itself during the Napoleonic Wars that really elevate the insurers. Next slide, please. And the insurers are getting the US government through it. They're getting American merchants through it. They are merchants themselves, right? So this is an ongoing integrated risk project. They don't always follow the law. So I like to show this slide. This is an insurance policy from 1812, where Messrs. Jonathan Dorr and Company are obviously engaging in a trade route that they're not supposed to be doing during the War of 1812. But they're saying it's not us that's getting insured. We are acting as agents on behalf of someone who's the actual recipient of this insurance policy. They don't even bother writing in like a fake name of who it is that's insured, because the insurers know that Jonathan Dorr and Company are engaging in illicit trade. And sure enough, I didn't include the back of this policy, but Jonathan Dorr and Company does lose the ship in the end, I think to a British naval ship. And the back of the policy says we paid out the loss to Jonathan Dorr. So he is doing something naughty, and the insurance companies know it. And so regardless of what US law says, merchants and insurers are so collaborative that they can make their own decisions about how deep in the gray area of US legality they want to operate. And it's a legality that they themselves are helping to make. Like, who even knows what the like gray areas of US law look like? Like, there aren't a lot of precedents yet. We just barely had a country. All right, next slide, please. So the overall attitude, again, in the beginning of the 19th century, there are a lot of insurance companies. They tend to say that, for example, Thomas Jefferson should not impose an embargo on U.S. trade. We should not declare war with Britain, because we have these insurance companies, and they are the ones that moderate U.S. risk. Just like the British admiral said in the quote I gave you at the beginning of this talk, that if the insurance companies are the ones who can and should decide on behalf of Americans what trade is risky or not. I don't think that's quite the same as saying that the free market should decide. It's like these specific groups of expert people who have knowledge and positioning that is really political, right? They're not outside of the political world. They're trying to make a market that they can operate in, but it's one that's organized by political risk. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so then the last two chapters of this book are sort of about sliding out of this Napoleonic Wars period, when, by and large, for the insurance sector, things have gone extraordinarily well. By the time the War of 1812 begins, in other words, by the time the British Navy is really turning its full force on American ships. I mean, it's not its full force. We're still dealing with Napoleon out there. But by this time, American insurance companies have had like 2 decades to accumulate capital, to navigate really successfully in this high risk, high reward environment. There are sort of robust functioning financial markets. So if they don't want to underwrite, there are other things they can do with their money. So they're extraordinarily successful at surviving and sort of planning to deal with this really difficult period. And they've made a lot of money for their shareholders. And on the bigger level, one way of thinking about this is to say that insurers are generously repaid for the bets they made on the United States, or if you like, for the investments they made in the United States. They have these corporate charters from the states that are getting renewed. They're able to shape the legal system in a way that suits their interests, and I'm happy to talk more about that. They pay very little taxes. But after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, insurance and there's like relative peace on the oceans. The people who are excited about this high risk, high reward financial world sort of got to go in other directions. So where do they go? So next slide, please. So I look at this guy, Jacob Barker, and I look at the world that's around him. He's sort of a less successful Robert Morris. He's like a cut rate financier. Robert Morris is like, who is also an insurer. Robert Morris is the big financier of the American Revolution. Jacob Barker wants to be Robert Morris. And for the War of 1812, he doesn't do so well. But people like him sort of, they take some pieces of the insurance business into this high risk, high reward zone that's continuing. Latin American revolutions, arms trading, contraband, covert slave trading is part of this world too. There's some underwriting of that. Some of these folks go west. Jacob Barker ends up in New Orleans. And some of them go to Wall Street and cause chaos there. So that's where these guys end up. So they sort of come into the insurance sector and then they come out. Now, next chapter. One of the things that happens is that Americans forget that early American insurance was big. And they forget that it was a high risk business, because now sort of investing in the government, like buying government securities, sounds sort of stable. It sounds like, yeah, an institutional investor buys government securities. Insurers like to talk about how they don't like to take risks. So it's really easy and convenient for people who were involved in this like almost pirate level risk-taking trade of the founding era. They mature into this sort of staid older lifestyle where they can memory hole the risks that they were actually taking. So next slide. I have two quotes that I put up for you to sort of spark conversations about that. Or I talk about how it's useful and profitable for insurance companies to seem boring. It helps keep them out of the public eye. It keeps them from being politicized, makes them seem like safe investments. So on the right, one of Boston's richest men of the early 19th century is this insurance broker, Peter Chardon Brooks, who in his youth is obviously this sort of risk-taking young scion who's off for various adventures in the Mediterranean. And he like writes to his friend about how like fortune is this fickle divinity. By his old age, his son-in-law, Edward Everett, more famous for other things, is talking about his father-in-law as somebody who never took risks, who avoided investments attended with risk and uncertainty. And it's just absolutely not true. But it becomes part of this narrative of how they're trying to make the founding generation of American merchants seem like noble patriots, but also people who never took risks in the interest of money. And one of the big projects of my book is to say that's absolutely not true, that people who think they're patriots can also very much be in it for the money, and they it is sometimes to their benefit to not have you remember that. The other story on the left is funny, but it's too long. If you want to go over it in the questions, that's fine, or you can buy the book from booksellers everywhere and read about it yourself. Next slide, please. So on the broadest level, again, so what I've told here is the story about this sort of transnational commercial infrastructure that is like very suddenly and dramatically becoming part of the business of American state making due to these particular circumstances, that corporations are possible, that the US has this big merchant fleet, that the Napoleonic and French Revolutionary Wars are raging. This giant sector of finance is created all at once, does a lot of work, sort of bets on the United States, and is then pretty swiftly forgotten. In terms of contemporary conclusions, which I'm not really that good at coming up with those. It's not what this book was really about. But one is that governments are always in the risk business, even if they don't do it on purpose, or even if they do nothing, they're still a government doing nothing about risk is still a government that's part of somebody's risk calculus. And so in the Napoleonic Wars, and for early modern states more generally, the obvious context was warfare. And I was just teaching earlier this year Thomas Hobbes to Columbia undergrads. So even Hobbes, who's sort of this caricature of this figure of the giant all-powerful ruler and state, says like, if your government doesn't protect you, if your king doesn't protect you, like that's not a king. That's a risk calculus. Today, we talk more about risk calculuses for things like COVID or climate change. And again, what a government is doing or not doing is always part of this calculation that people are making about what they can do, what they can do to try to make money, what they can do safely, right? There's other kinds of risks than financial risks to their health we care about now. but the government's actions or non-actions are always part of their calculations. So insurance is really always political. And so when you change the way that risk works, you have, in a way, changed the state itself. And so that's something that, as we face all kinds of giant new risks today in our world, I think it's something worth thinking about more deeply. So bang, that is on for 2:40. So we have a full 20 minutes of questions. I hope I hope Kevin will help me navigate these questions. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to the conversation. Kevin, what should we do?
I am here. I'm back. Welcome. I just wanted to first apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning, and I do appreciate everybody's patience as we got that taken care of. So thank you so much. We do have questions in the chat, and I would like to remind folks that if you do have questions for Hannah, you're welcome to add those to the chat. And you can upvote questions that you wished you thought of and typed in first. So please do so. We have a lot of questions there to get a hold of. While we kind of review some of those, I would like to kind of get things started, Hannah, by asking you a couple myself. First, I did want to kind of start off by just acknowledging the prologue that I had, actually, we talked about this prior ourselves. But I wanted to acknowledge the prologue of the book, in which you, in second person, describe a visit to a marine insurance company and how insurance works. It's a really complex process. It's something that I knew very little of personally or intellectually, historically. And you describe everything so brilliantly and so clearly, from locating and negotiating with insurance companies, considering the length and multiple stops or destinations and various risks involved in a particular voyage, the various goods one would carry, the actual agreements and payments of the policy, and everything in between. So I wanted to just first acknowledge that for those who haven't read the book, everything is really beautifully and effectively kind of broken down and unpacked in terms of process and practice. Thinking about process and practice, I did kind of want to shift to your own practice and process in making the book. And I was wondering if we could just begin by sharing a little bit of your own experience in various archives, specifically working with ledgers, account books, checkbooks, and really reading and unpacking those kinds of documents that I think many of us aren't necessarily equipped or trained to read through initially. And so, just kind of working through how you kind of taught yourself to kind of read through and read into these documents. And overall, what did you find?
Yeah, so one of the things that I tried to do with this book is to show exactly the slide back and forth between the world of numbers and the political worlds where people are making meaning of those numbers. And that is a back and forth that insurers themselves handle really adeptly. So for me, I trained myself like I was a baby accountant merchant of the 18th century. I read handbooks. I read some of them at the American Antiquarian Society. I read the bookkeeping. I looked at the numbers. So that was one body of knowledge that I had to form to understand what they were doing, which I do take seriously. And at the same time, to look at the letters that they were writing to each other, to look at the things that were said and unsaid, to look at the assumptions that they made, the things that they didn't argue about with each other. Because one of the extraordinary things about merchants forming insurance groups is how much they do want to collaborate with one another. They don't want to undercut one another on rates. That's no good. They'd like everybody to charge nicely equivalent insurance rates so that nobody loses too much money who's a shareholder, a big shareholder of an insurance company. One of my favorite pieces of the book that was so hard to write, but I was trying to sort of turn the relationship between numbers and interpretation inside out, is a debate during the American Revolution about whether merchants are price gouging customers for things that they import to America during the Revolution, because merchants again are under suspicion. Are they Americans or are they out for their own profit? And what the merchants do in this chapter is they say it's the insurers that are insurance rates. It's not the insurers. It's just that we have to pay insurance if we are going to import at all. Otherwise, we wouldn't take the risk of importing anything. It was salt in this case. We have to pay the insurance on our salt. And because of this complex way in which we calculate the cost of insurance rates are extremely high on salt. That's why salt costs 40 times what we pay for it when we sell it to you, the customer. It's not that we are greedy. So what they don't mention is that it's the merchants that also own the insurance companies, right? That this is a significantly endogenous business. So if they charge themselves very high insurance rates, to some degree, I'll spare you the details, but to some degree, the numbers sort of cancel each other out. So insurers want to show their calculations, but they know that these numbers are going to intimidate people, that people are not going to be able to follow these calculations, or they're just going to see the numbers themselves, as people do today, as sources of expertise. So my process really involved both sort of learning these numbers and being sort of overwhelmed by their how many of them there are, and they're powerful, and then saying, but wait a minute, these are just people who are operating, they're using these numbers for political purposes as well. So that's a story that I tried to tell, where it's both real and it's a political project at the same time.
Great, thank you so much. Based on this idea of possible price gouging, I have a couple of questions for you from the audience here.
Yeah.
First is that you mentioned that merchants themselves created the law which governed how insurance operated in international trade. Was there an accepted manner for dispute resolution? And if so, what was it? And then also attached to this idea of price gouging, was there a negative term or slur or attack for insurers?
Okay, I'll answer that one first. Again, because they generally stay out of the public eye, this children's book from AAS that talks about the merchant does not talk about insurers. By the mid-19th century in US antebellum literature, insurers are grouped together with other sorts of like brokers, financiers, people on Wall Street, so the people that Bartleby the Scrivener hates, the sort of world of pell-mell mid-19th century capitalism. But that's always, so what's that always coupled with is what I think is this inappropriate nostalgia for a previous age when people were more honest, where they took risks for purely patriotic reasons. And I just don't think that world ever really existed, and certainly not in the age of the American founding. Like, there's great work about how US finance is a venture in itself, right, as a post-colonial power, if that's a term that you accept. So there isn't really, I think brokers in general have a sort of a negative connotation. There's the term broker, but insurance brokers who stay close to the reputable merchant world are not generally going to have a problem. They don't want to be like associated with pawnbrokers or people who are dealing with sort of shabby financial trading, right? There's a sort of a cultural hierarchy for brokering of all kinds. Insurers are trying to stay quieter or on the good side of them. Okay, so the question, sorry, what was the other question again? Oh,
was there an accepted manner for dispute resolution?
Oh, sure. All right. So what insurers always have is the ability to venue shop, basically, because they're often transnational in their transactions. They can decide how much foreign, if your merchant ship is captured by a foreign privateer and taken to a foreign admiralty court for adjudication about whether it's contraband or not, you at home can decide how much to accept of that. There are clauses in the standard American insurance policy that say you have to agree to go to arbitration. Often they do. Often it isn't even formal arbitration. There's just back and forth because everybody wants to get out of the situation in one piece as much as possible. They can go to state courts. They can go to federal courts. legal historians will tell you one thing about a trajectory of insurance adjudication into federal law over the 19th century. And that's their thing. That's what legal historians do. They find the legal trajectory. What I'm interested in is multiple generations of unclarity, of time periods where a merchant can use arbitration, where they can do backroom deals, where they can go to state court, where they can go to federal court, where they can maneuver to, again, decide what venue is most appropriate for them. And at the same time, what they're doing is they are serving as the experts that guide the formation of US commercial law, because again, nobody knows better than they do. The expertise is real. And so early American jurists, early American insurance law is an incredibly lucrative field of law because these are the merchants who have the money. These are the corporations that have the money, and they're very dependent on merchant insurer experts to tell them how this law should work. If they can't, they don't want to get it wrong. This business, the musical chairs have to keep going. So they maintain control over this process, and they maintain control of how deep they dip into that process.
While we're thinking about that expertise and that expert knowledge that insurers bring, I think one of the things that made me really rethink the Revolutionary War and the years after that was how you describe Atlantic insurers as really kind of the most informed and up-to-date group on both local and global news. So while I think one of the themes of the book is the ways in which insurers were working alongside the government, I think for me, one of the questions that really arises from this is how the government used insurers for specific information, and maybe more specifically, how did Atlantic insurers get their information? Where did they get their news? And maybe even more specifically, did local gossip, misinformation from competitors, wartime propaganda, inflated or fake news stories posted or published in newspapers, how did that affect their decision making?
All right, so how do they get their news, and how does it get to government? All right, now there's two pieces. So the first piece is, how do they get their news? So they're newspaper addicts. They're part of this big story of how American business news takes shape. They subscribe to newspapers from all the different port cities that are relevant. They also have private correspondence networks because the merchants who own their shares are interested in the company staying up to date. The directors are interested in staying up to date. The company directors are experienced merchants in their own right, and they have their own networks. Also, American insurers have people overseas, and they start to have that like officially sometimes, or they write overseas. They write to British Admiralty Court judges saying, how would you rule on such and such a matter? They have people in consulates overseas helping American merchants deal with complicated litigation in foreign courts, because often, like, the insurance company stands to gain if the American merchant gets at least something back, right? There's sometimes compromises to be made, or in these British Admiralty courts across the Caribbean, they're just trying to manage these things directly as much as possible. So formal news, informal networks, having people directly on site, all of these things are ways that they get information. Yeah, sometimes the information is not good, but they do correct. And so I have some series of insurance rates that I track. I put one or two of them in the book. There's a lot more that it just wasn't a part of the story. So there's a lot of information that I did not share for you, tragically. But there are times where something like bad will happen in the Caribbean, and you see like an insurance rate will spike to Havana or something, to a really high number. And then it'll come back down as the merchants get more information about what the situation actually is. So you feel bad for not too bad, but you feel a little bad for the merchant who bought the insurance policy really high when he thought he had no choice. And I've seen 25, 50, 60% insurance rates, like for real. And then they come back down and the market sort of stabilizes. And that happens at Lloyd's too. People panic. And then things settle down as it turns out that even wars are mostly manageable and sometimes extremely profitable for insurance companies. And this is true for Mediterranean trade. This was true. I've had people write to me after reading this book who were like underwriting during the Gulf War. There are people who are underwriting now in sort of Ukrainian peripheral regions. And again, there's like the initial shock and then the calculation starts to kick in again. Now, they're politically motivated in what information they communicate to the government. So there are several places where insurance companies are being asked to gather information from their merchant customers about like how much shipping losses have we actually experienced to the British versus the French. Like if we got to decide who to declare war on, we should know who is actually doing us the most damage. And the federal government's like 5 people, like they don't know, it's the American merchants, their correspondents it's the insurers who are aggregating this information about losses, and with political goals of their own in mind, are passing this information up the chain to say, we don't need an embargo. Again, we can keep the music playing. We can keep this system in motion if you just let us control it. So it is this sort of ongoing tussle between insurance and the United States about who controls American merchants. And I had an argument with a law professor about this last week because he was like, is there really a tension here? Because these people see themselves as patriotic and in some respect, they all want the same thing. And yeah, that's true. But these are two systems. If you take the world of like early modern states seriously, these are two systems that are in tension with one another. And if your insurance company says one thing about what you should do and your United States says a different thing, who are you going to listen to?
We have a question from the audience here asking, in the late 18th and early 19th century, were insurance companies underwriting at any significant level risk outside of maritime trade and fire risk?
Not well, and certainly not in the United States. The marine insurance companies would occasionally insure a sailor's life as sort of part of one of the things that they did. There are life insurance experiments like in London. There are these crazy financial schemes called tontines that are sort of reverse life insurance schemes. Like they pay out to you as long as you are alive, and then when you die, it's over, and they divide your share among everybody else who is alive. But no, this is so the big money that's like real trader, like the sector that can summon actual wealth is the marine insurance sector. US fire insurance companies start multiplying quite quickly too, and that's another thing that somebody else should do more and more work on. But you just don't take in as much money with a fire insurance policy. Like that could be, it's like 1% of your property value that gets you a 7-year policy. Whereas a policy on a particular shipment of goods, I mean, that ship is going to come in and you're going to be able to settle up pretty quickly in a pretty high quantity. So there are a lot of fire insurance companies. They tend to be more sort of investment vehicles, speculation projects. I try not to use judgmental language because it really depends how serious they are. But the marine business is the one that's bringing in the big money, and life, not in the US, not till urbanization, not till the mid 19th century does it really become big. That's when you have those big insurance buildings in Hartford and Philadelphia start to sprout up. The second half of the 19th century, when insurance starts to have something to say to the American public. We're stable, we're here. So there's a lot of built environment work that you can do here as well. Whereas the marine insurance offices tended to just be like upstairs from the bank, behind the bank, down by the water. The people who need to know.
I think this next question kind of ties into that a little bit, regarding how impersonal insurance was and whether or not it was available to merchants in distant cities. So the question kind of continues on that. Was it mostly a business of acquaintances? And when specifically did Boston, New York, Philadelphia, et cetera, become centers for larger insurance markets?
It depends what you mean by larger. I think, once you have corporations, they do draw in capital from broader groups of shareholders who might be from elsewhere in the state. They are, Sorry, what was the first part of the question? So Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Oh, how much was it acquaintances? I think the core of it is often a certain set of acquaintances, but I've seen letters where people write in for insurance policies and it's clear they don't know the office. But what's holding this together? So to some degree, social trust is holding this together. And to some degree, it's the fact that they're not drilling down very deep on what the risks are. Like they'll say, is this a good, some people will say, I need an insurance policy. I'm going to Havana. I've got a good ship. I've got this many men. I want this much money of insurance on it. And the companies will do it. And they'll sort of bet that they'll be able to, if something goes wrong and they're asked to indemnify the merchant, then they'll say, okay, like, show us who you are, show us that they were good men, show us that it was this ship that didn't have any problems to begin with. So the merchant then has to produce a stack of paperwork. That it's about destination and political risk really broadly. I don't want to say it's crude because it's so complex, but where they're being really fine about the decisions that they're making is not about the quality of the ship or how well you know the guy or whatever. They're like it's largely communal, and then they will take risks on people who seem legit and see what plays out because they have control over the project later.
I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions if we can squeeze them in. First, one person asks here if you could say a little bit more about insurance in relation to the slave trade.
Yeah, so it's never as big in America before or after the revolution as it is at Lloyd's of London, for example. American slave trading has some hotspots, as these attendees probably know, like in Charleston, like in Bristol, Rhode Island. It's never that big outside the hotspots. The hotspots are definitely getting serviced, but American corporations do not tend to go too deep on slave trade insurance. Again, except for like the Bristol Insurance Company, which is the corporate project of the DeWolf family of Rhode Island. They got their bank, they got their insurance company, they got their like slave trading voyages. There's a lot of back-end whisper network slave trading insurance that's going on. So one thing that I had to say very carefully in this book, because it comes from the records of an active corporation, INA, which is now Cigna, which is now Chubb, I think. They're like an active corporation from the 18th century. This great economic historian named Christopher Kingston has gone through their policies, and they've gone through their policies. And there are insured voyages on goods going to Africa. They don't have insured return cargoes of enslaved people. Now, what are those ships doing in Africa, right? What are they getting for their return cargoes? Like, not souvenirs, right? But what's happening, in a lot of places is that people in the know are insuring slave voyages not through corporations, and they do it on these private books that are largely vanished. There's some circumstantial evidence. There's some like obvious like they all know guys who are doing this, and it is a thing that happens. And then gradually over the 19th century, the slave trade shifts toward just in general being financed in other ways, and so you don't need US-based underwriters as much to take on that risk. So it definitely happens. It is rather behind the scenes.
Great. Thank you. I think this will be the last one for the day. I'm sorry, we have several others that we're just not going to get to today. But
feel free to email me. I'll put my email address in the chat. I'm happy to talk to any of you. Let's just do that now. Sorry I interrupted you, Kevin. Go ahead.
No, thank you. Thank you. Took the words out of my mouth. The last one's a bit of a fun one, so we'll end on kind of on a lighter note here. Melanie Hernandez asks, you've been cracking up throughout the presentation. Are there any absolutely bonkers stories that you've uncovered that either didn't make it into the book or something that you can share that made it into the book that you can kind of leave as a little teaser or trailer?
My favorite is one that I had to smoosh down to a footnote, but it was a dispute about whether the captain had done his due diligence to prevent rat damage to a cargo of grain. And so this is a sort of an apocryphal story that a Scottish broker is passing on to one of his American correspondence. And he says that the captain got very irritated to be challenged on this issue because he insisted that he did do his due diligence, and he brought his ship's cat to court in a bag. And he brought the cat into the courtroom and said, "This is the cat. He's very good," or something like that. He's been protecting my cargoes from grain. That just goes to show you how deep this idea of sort of the customary best practices of commerce go, and how it can all be litigated in different forums if people are motivated to do that, if they think that's the best way to get their money.
Thank you. With that, I would like to conclude the program today, and I'd like to thank Hannah for joining us. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you. As a reminder, this talk will be published on the AAS YouTube channel in the coming weeks. I do encourage attendees today to complete the evaluation that is included in the chat, and to check out future AAS programs by signing up to the History of the Book mailing list. We do have a very big week for programs next week at AAS. On Tuesday, April 5th at 7 p.m., Tavolia Glimpf will give a presentation on her new book, The Women's Fight, the Civil War's Battles for Home, Freedom, and Nation. And then on Thursday next week, April 7th, also at 7 p.m., we hope that you can join us to hear historian Taya Miles as she discusses her book, All That She Carried, the journey of Ashley Sack, a Black family keepsake. Our next book talk will take place on Tuesday, April 28th at 2 p.m. as usual. Our guest then will be Jennifer Putsey, professor of English at William and Mary, who will speak on her new book, Fair Copy, Relational Poetics and Antebellum American Women's Poetry. Finally, I would like to remind folks that tomorrow is the application deadline for the History of the Book Summer Seminar, entitled Black Print, Black Activism, Black Study, and led by Derek Spires and Ben Fagan. For more information, there is a link that will be available in the chat. Again, the deadline is April 1. If there are any questions, or if you'd like to apply but maybe can't make this deadline, please contact me directly. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you for your patience today. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a great semester. Thank you.
Thank you.